What I want to do today is I want to look at the one little incident that happens. We know that Avram Avinu is old. We know he's gone through this whole process. It's been a difficult space for him. He had to bury his wife. But he gets up. Everything is established. He's got that place, and he goes back home. Avram Zaken Baba Yamim, the Torah says, V'Adonai Beirachet Avram Bakol. That Avram is Zaken Baba Yamim. He's old. He's lived his life, a full life. The Mefarshim explain that Zaken from the Gemara, that when he's old and he was Baba Yamim, which means he's like old of days, because he lived every day properly. And Hashem blessed him Bakol. Bakol, and the discussion is that with a daughter, not a daughter. It's a thing I saw from the Vilna Gaon, where he asked, how do we know? We know that Avram Avinu, from the psukim of Vayera, we know that Avram Avinu kept Pesach because it says he served them matzah. But how do we know that Avram Avinu kept Sukkot? So the Vilna Gaon says we know it from this word, Barechet Avram Bakol. Why Bakol? Because the pasuk says, Basukot seishvu Shivat Shamim Kol Ezrach B'Yisrael Yesher Basukot Laman Yedu Dorotechem Ki Basukot Hashavti B'nei Yisrael Mitzrayim. That's the pasuk. And each one there's three different clauses. The first clause starts with a bet, the second with the chaf, and the third with the lamed. And therefore he says that because the pasuk dealing with Sukkot starts the bet, the chaf, and the lamed, that spells bakol. And therefore we see that Hashem Beirachet Avraham even with the mitzvah of Sukkot. Okay, that's a cute idea from the Vilna Gaon. But I want to look at the next pasuk, because the next pasuk is very, very difficult to understand. Yomer Avraham el Avdo Zakan Beito. Avraham now says to his eved, his servant, Zakan Beito, the elder of his home, who looks after everything. And he says to him, Sim na yadcha tachas yirechi, put your hand under my thigh, va'ashbi'acha b'Adonai Elohei Hashemayim, and I'll make you swear in the name of Hashem, the God of heaven, Elohei Haaretz, and the God of the land, asher lo tikach isha livni mibnot haknani, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanim, asher anochi nosher b'kirbo, that I'm living amongst. And really what I want to try and understand is, what is this business where Avram Avinu says to Eliezer, put your hand under my thigh. Not only that, is he never refers to him as Eliezer. But Avram el Avdo Zakan Beito, it refers to him as his slave, the elder of his home. It doesn't really give him much covered in that way. So if we look at it carefully, so there is another point in history in Torah where we see a similar vow that happens, and that is when the time of Yaakov is coming to an end, and Yaakov calls his son, and he calls Yosef, and Yosef comes to him, and he says to him, "Simna yadcha tachas yavechi." Put your hand under my thigh. Take a vow that when you put it there, please don't bury me in Mitzrayim. And Yosef says, I'll do whatever you say. But Yomer Shavali says, no, it's not good enough just to say that you'll do it. I want you to make a vow. And he swears to him, and he swears to him, and then Yaakov passes away. So the question is, what is this business about putting your hand by his thigh in order to make this vow? So it's fascinating. There's a Babylonian letter from the city of Kisura in South Mesopotamia, okay, that it was translated from the cuneiform. Now the only reason I know this is because I looked it up. Okay, it's not something I know. And there it tells a story about this man who also had an envoy. He had an envoy, had a servant, and he says to his servant the same thing, except it's much more graphic, which I'm not going to go through. But he says also he's got to grab in that place. And then he says, once you've made the vow on that, I'll give you what you need to do to take to Beruria, the son of Menanum. Okay, that's not important who the person is. But the point is that there's this concept that clearly is an age-old place of taking a vow, that you hold onto something. In this case, it would be in the case of in Babylonia, in the city of Kisura, he was actually be holding onto the person's genitals in some way, right? Whereas we see that what Avraham Avinu says is put your hand under my thigh, tachat yerechi. Rashi says, what does it mean, tachat yerechi? Why is it so important? It says because when a person takes a vow, they have to have in their hand a chayfetz shel mitzvah, some type of mitzvah object. Kagon Sefer Torah or Tefillin, like a Sefer Torah Tefillin. I don't know. Remember when we were kids, there used to be this thing at King David. So I'm not sure if it had any real relevance. So 10 fingers on my Jewish Torah, whatever that means. But that's what we said. But the point is that it's clear that this is the idea: is that you have to hold when you take a vow. You have to hold on to some type of chayfetz of mitzvah, the mitzvah. And the only chayfetz of mitzvah, the only mitzvah object that was at this point in time was milah. And so that was he filled it with pain, with effort, and so therefore it was so dear to him, and so therefore Avraham Avinu uses this chayfetz shel mitzvah as the means whereby Eliezer is going to take this vow. So that's quite a big thing to understand it. Now the Mefarshim try and understand what this is, what this is all about. So the first thing is, like, why Dafka did he use that? Surely we know that Avraham Avinu has come. He's got another mitzvah. He had the mitzvah of Akedas Yitzchak. So why doesn't Eli somehow take a vow on the Akedah? Why does he have to grab onto something in order to do this? So the Maharal says the following. He says that that has to be on a physical mitzvah. It can't be on some type of conceptual mitzvah, but all it's got to be on a physical mitzvah. And therefore, but we know that Avraham Avinu kept all the mitzvahs. So if he kept all the mitzvahs, so he must have had tefillin, he must have had, I don't know, Sefer Torah, you can't say it, but he must have had some object of mitzvah. We said now just before this that Hashem Barachet Avram Bakol, he kept the mitzvah of sukkah, so maybe he could have just grabbed onto a sukkah, maybe he could have grabbed onto the lulav at Esrog, something. Why dafka is it this? Because the minhag says the Maral, nirei lamadavadai minhag ba'osus man liyot nishba kach lesum yad tachat hayerech shami shehu nishbalo. Said because that was the minhag at the time. The minhag at the time is that the way they would take the vows, we saw from the thing from Mesopotamia, is that the minhag was that they would make a vow in this way. What Avraham Avinu does to this vow is that he takes a minhag and he attaches it to a mitzvah. And that's really what it's all about, is that it's one thing for us to do what the rest of the world do. But if we are able to take that and attach it to something which is spiritual, then it gives it a whole different level. So why, when it comes to Yaakov Avinu, says the Maharal, why when it comes to Yaakov does he tell Yosef to do the same thing? So he says, because, and this is such an incredible thing, he had to do it according to the minhag of the Egyptians. Why? So Paro wouldn't say it. He said, because Paro would say, if he hadn't done it according to the minhag of the place, Paro would have said to him, your father promised you to do something, but he didn't do according to the rules, according to the law, according to what we do in order to make a shvua chal, in order to make a shvua sit, to really to really fix itself onto that thing. Therefore, Paro would have said to him, there's no vow here. Therefore, Yaakov makes him do the shvua in the way of the way the Egyptians did. Okay, so that's a nice idea. The Emek Davar says that what we need to understand is that in what Avraham Avinu does is that is something that is part of the minhag of the time, but as a minhag of the time a little bit differently from the ways other people explained it. What he explains, he says that during that time there were two minhagim. There was a minhag when it came to your servant that he would hold onto your thigh. When it came to a person who was equal to you, So then you would shake hands. That's what he says. So he's saying that the concept of shaking hands is an age-old concept. Simat yad biyad. You put one hand into the other, and he learns that out from a pasuk in Yechezkel. But av levno ve'eved ladonav ein derech eresh lashvat yad biyad. When it comes with a father to a son and a slave to his master, it's not appropriate. You can't say yad biyad. You can't say hand in hand, and therefore he says to him to put his hand under his thigh. Now, what's fascinating there is this whole idea of the fact that when the Torah describes Eliezer, who was domestic, he was the person. Domestic means he learned Torah from him. He was an unbelievably great human being. The Gemara says Eliezer, but the Torah here describes Eliezer as the Eved of Avraham, the slave of Avraham. And because he's a slave, the engagement that is happening now between Avraham and Eliezer needs to be one that sits within that framework, which is the framework of slave master, and therefore he has to put his simcha yadchan tachat yerechi. The Chizkuni says something remarkable. He says, why does the Torah describe Eliezer as Zakan Beito? Avdo is a kan beito. He's the elder of his house, and the Chizkuni says va'en lachashdo al ha'arayot. He was not. He didn't in any way suspect him because he was already an older man. He didn't have to worry that he would take advantage of his position in some type of inappropriate sexual relationships or sexual conduct. Exactly what the Chizkuni is saying is not clear, but one could say that the Chizkuni says that the Torah is describing Eliezer as the kan beito, because even when he's putting his hand tachat yerecho on his thigh, he's saying that Eliezer is not a person who would take advantage of that, remembering, and this is fundamentally important what the Chizkuni is saying, because remember that Eliezer, as great as he was, he does not come from the seed of Avraham Avinu. He doesn't come from the seed of Shem. He actually comes from the seed of whom? Of Ham, of Canaan. Eliezer is a Canaanite. And since Eliezer is a Canaanite, if you remember, the last time the Canaanim had anything to do with the nakedness of their elder, that was a disaster. That was when Ham did whatever he did. Either, as we said, he castrated Noach, or he had some type of homosexual relationship with Noach, right? So that, the Chizkuni could be pointing out that Avraham wasn't worried about that at all. Because why? Because not only was he a great person, Eliezer, but he's also a little bit old. And there is a revealing thing here, and I think that's a fundamental thing for us to understand, that if he's such a great person, why would he in any way, think of him, be worried about him in terms of some type of inappropriate conduct? And so perhaps the answer could be is that the Gemara tells us, and apitropos la'arayos, that when it comes to physical desire, no matter how great a person is, the Yetzer Hara is easily focused on overcoming their strength. So that's something too important to bear in mind. Okay. The Chizkuni also points out, which is quite an amazing thing. He mentions this whole idea of how they would take the vow, and he says there, "V'zeh odenu hayom be'eretz Hodu." At his time, when the time the Chizkuni was written, which is in like the Middle Ages, that this concept of taking a vow between a servant and a master was still in practice in Hodu in India, which is I think is quite fascinating. Okay. So we see different ways of understanding what this is all about, but what is fundamental for us to understand is that is the idea of there needs to be a connection to mitzvah. The Meir Malul says the following: touching the procreative organ while promising to maintain the cohesion of the family must have entailed invoking the ancestral spirits of the family to witness and assure the fulfillment of the promise. Failure to keep it, or an attempt to violate the principle of the family cohesion, would arouse the wrath of the ancestral spirits. That's what Avraham Avinu was saying to Eliezer, because Eliezer doesn't come from this greatness. They may still be involved in, whilst he was monotheistic, maybe he still had this concept of the ancestral spirits. And what is important of this is that is the impurity and continuity of the family, conceived as an entity existing and is significant throughout time, both within and beyond the confines of life on earth, which are at stake in these last requests. Avraham Avinu, in telling Eliezer what to do, takes on whatever he can in order to ensure that Eliezer holds by the oath that he will find a wife, an appropriate wife for Yitzchak. Avraham doesn't know how old, when he's going to die. He doesn't know whether he'll survive the journey that Eliezer is going to take to go and find a wife. And so therefore he trusts him, but he trusts him and he makes him swear on all that is sacred to him Eliezer, that to ensure that there will be a continuity of the Jewish people in that way. Have a beautiful day, everybody. Please God, we'll continue tomorrow.